April 1967. A young American sailor stands on the deck of a Navy cruiser off the coast of North Vietnam. A blast in the night throws him into the pitch-black water, and in a war zone where luck rarely favors the lost, he vanishes beneath the waves. Hours later, he wakes not on a rescue ship, but in enemy hands. Within days, he is behind the walls of the Hỏa Lò Prison, a place feared by every American who served in Vietnam. What happened next would defy expectation, reshape intelligence gathered from inside those walls, and turn a quiet kid from South Dakota into someone the North Vietnamese never saw coming. Welcome to the Shelldrake Files. Doug Hegdahl was born on September 3, 1946 in Clark, South Dakota. He grew up in a tight-knit Midwestern community. His parents were Norwegian-American Lutherans, and the family owned a small downtown hotel humorously nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by locals. Doug enjoyed a typical rural American childhood. He was active in the Boy Scouts and played sports, but he admits he didn't apply himself fully in school. In fact, it took him over 4 years to finish high school. He finally graduated a few months after his 19th birthday, on May 24, 1966. Almost immediately, he joined the U.S. Navy. His mother had urged him to enlist rather than wait for the draft, believing it would keep him safer. Though he'd never even seen the ocean before, young Doug was ready for an adventure and signed up for training. This decision would set him on an unexpected path far from home. After boot camp and schooling, Doug Hegdahl was assigned as a seaman apprentice to the USS Canberra, a heavy cruiser stationed in the Pacific. The Canberra's mission was to provide naval gunfire support during the Vietnam War, bombarding enemy positions along the coast. Hegdahl's duties aboard ship were relatively routine and unglamorous, but his youth and eagerness stood out. By early 1967, Hegdahl had achieved the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class and was just 20 years old. On the night of April 6, 1967, with the Canberra steaming about 3 miles off North Vietnam's coast in the Gulf of Tonkin, Hegdahl went up on deck to watch the ship's guns firing at targets. Suddenly, a 5-inch shell blew out of a gun port nearby and knocked him overboard. In the dark, he lost consciousness and plunged into the cold sea. When Hegdahl came to, he found himself treading water. Despite the panic, he relied on his strength and kept himself afloat. Hours passed before North Vietnamese fishermen spotted him. These civilians treated him decently at first, but by the end of the day he was handed over to the North Vietnamese army. From there, he was taken to Hanoi and thrown into the Hỏa Lò Prison, known to U.S. POWs as the Hanoi Hilton. Hegdahl was now the youngest and lowest-ranking American prisoner at the Hanoi Hilton. The camp typically housed high-ranking officers, pilots, and other notable prisoners. Initially, the North Vietnamese interrogators assumed Hegdahl was some kind of intelligence agent or spy, because it seemed so unlikely that a sailor would just accidentally fall off a ship. Hegdahl himself later recalled that they even accused him of making up the entire story. But he had a plan. He realized that if he pretended to be naive or cognitively limited, the enemy would see him as useless. So he played dumb. He spoke in simple language, claimed he could barely read, and generally acted like a bumbling farm boy. His country bumpkin act soon convinced his captors he had nothing important to offer. The North Vietnamese guards quickly dubbed him the incredibly stupid one. The act worked. The guards decided he was not worth torturing or subjecting to intense interrogation for useful propaganda. So instead of solitary confinement or beatings, Hegdahl was given relative freedom around the camp. He was assigned chores and tasks like mopping floors or cleaning trucks. menial labor that put him in contact with other prisoners. In essence, by pretending to be harmless, he earned the trust of his captors and freedom to observe. While the Hanoi Hilton was known for the brutal torture of its prisoners, Hegdahl's naive persona spared him the worst of it. He spent much of his time in communal areas and even got to goof off with the few Vietnamese propaganda broadcasts. Whenever the captors would force the American POWs to write confessions or anti-US statements, Hegdahl would agree to do it, but he wrote nonsense or performed so poorly that the enemy broadcasters were unable to use it. He later would joke that it became a personal game to see how badly he could sabotage their efforts. Most importantly, Hegdahl used his extended freedom in contacts to quietly help his fellow prisoners. He learned that US POWs had a secret tap code and password to recognize friendly Americans. Within days of being in the prison, he began committing to memory as much as he could. Fellow POWs named off the other prisoners, and Hegdahl drilled himself on those names, capture dates, service numbers, and personal details. He repeated the information over and over and over again. To remember hundreds of names, he used the children's song Old MacDonald Had a Farm, each new verse storing new data. By the time he left Vietnam, he had memorized 256 names and details of his fellow comrades. Hegdahl also passed his time by sabotaging enemy equipment. He later admitted that at night he would sneak out and put dirt into the fuel tanks, ultimately disabling 5 North Vietnamese trucks. These quiet acts of resistance, combined with the information he collected, made him an invaluable asset, though his captors never realized it. Inside Hỏa Lò Prison, officers and enlisted men worked together. Hegdahl's memory became an asset for everyone. A senior officer and fellow POW, U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Dick Stratton, later explained that no one believed Hegdahl could possibly remember all that information by himself. But he did. With help from Air Force Captain Joseph Kreka, they devised memory techniques. Hegdahl learned the layout of Hanoi so well, he even convinced guards he needed new eyeglasses and was driven into downtown Hanoi for a fitting so that he could sketch maps for possible future escape attempts. Having an updated list of names and statuses was critical. Many families back home had loved ones listed as missing in action. Hegdahl's list proved that dozens of those men were alive and in fact being held captive by the North Vietnamese. It ultimately led to 63 service members being reclassified from MIA to POW. For the families back home, this was momentous news. And for U.S. military planners, it provided hard intelligence on who the North Vietnamese were holding and in what condition. The precise address of the Hanoi Hilton itself was even obtained from Hegdahl's reports. In every way, Doug Hegdahl was working quietly to help his fellow prisoners. He risked being discovered, but his cover held. The combination of appearing useless to the enemy while secretly gathering intelligence was an act of true heroism far from any battlefield. By 1969, the Vietnam War had become a political issue in the United States. North Vietnam occasionally released a few POWs early as a propaganda gesture. The U.S. Military Code of Conduct, Article 3, clearly states that prisoners will never accept early release, so as not to be used by the enemy for potential propaganda. Doug Hegdahl was the reluctant exception to this. When he was approached by the North Vietnamese about taking an early release, he refused. He believed that by doing so he would be betraying his fellow prisoners and his country. It took Lieutenant Commander Stratton, Hegdahl's superior officer and longtime cellmate, to give him a direct order to accept the early release. Doug Hegdahl would reluctantly obey that order. On August 5, 1969, after 852 days in captivity, Doug Hegdahl walked out of the Hanoi Hilton as one of 3 Americans released that day. When he returned to U.S. custody, he immediately shared the valuable information he had memorized. Using tape recordings and notes, He recounted every detail of every POW whose information he had learned. Names, dates of capture, current condition. The information was so comprehensive that officials converted many MIAs to POW status and updated the Pentagon's list of captured personnel. The timing was impeccable. Hegdahl's first press conferences were held the same day that North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh had died, which coincided with a brief easing of tensions. His intelligence was credited with pressuring the North Vietnamese to slightly improve conditions for the remaining prisoners, for example, allowing more, although still limited communication. After his release and medical debriefing, Hegdahl did something unusual. He was sent to the Paris peace talks in December 1970. There he confronted the North Vietnamese with first-hand accounts of how the prisoners were treated. For a former low-ranking sailor, standing up on an international stage to challenge his captors directly was a rare honor and responsibility. But Doug Hegdahl's service to his country didn't end with his release from prison. He stayed in the Navy and used his experiences to help train others. After Vietnam, he was brought on as an instructor at the U.S. Navy's Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, or SEER School in San Diego. At SEER, he taught airmen, sailors, and even intelligence agents how to survive captivity, drawing on the lessons he had learned firsthand. Doug Hegdahl eventually left the Navy in 1970 as a petty officer second class. He settled in San Diego, using his military savings to buy a house near the beach. He worked as a civilian instructor at SEER for decades. Those who know Doug Hegdahl describe him as humble and private. He never sought the spotlight, even while history considered his actions among the most heroic non-combat feats of the Vietnam era. By the time he finally retired from the SEER program in 2001, he had helped train countless servicemen and women, passing on the wisdom he'd gained at such a young age in enemy hands. For his service and sacrifice, Doug Hegdahl earned several military honors, including the Purple Heart and the Prisoner of War Medal. Yet perhaps his greatest reward was knowing that he had helped save lives. The names of those 256 POWs meant that 63 families went from mourning to relief, and everyone who heard his reports knew their brothers in arms were still alive. In recent years, Hegdahl's story has started to gain wider recognition. Historians like Mark Leepson have documented Hegdahl's experience in books and interviews. In fact, a full biography titled The Unlikely War Hero, a Vietnam War POW story of courage and resilience in the Hanoi Hilton, was published in December 2024. Veterans groups and media outlets have long featured his story of ingenuity and bravery. Today, Doug Hegdahl lives a quiet life in San Diego, far from the battlefields of Southeast Asia. He rarely gives interviews, preferring the simple life he chose after the war. But on Veterans Day, and every day, his story reminds us that heroism isn't only about combat. Sometimes it's about sharp wit, determination, and helping your fellow man in the darkest of times. Doug Hegdahl's journey, from a small town in South Dakota to the halls of the Hanoi Hilton and back, is a powerful story of resilience and loyalty. He met incredible danger not with guns or fists, but with quick thinking and an extraordinary memory. His actions saved lives and changed the course of many fates. This Veterans Day, we honor all the men and women who have worn the uniform, those who served in times of war and those who stood a post in peace. Their dedication forms the quiet strength behind every story like Doug Hegdahl's, proof that courage and integrity can take many forms, from the battlefield to a prison cell half a world away. Let their service remind us that every act of duty, no matter where it occurs, carries the weight of our great nation's ideals.